Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video in the glorious Victorian October. Today I'm going to be talking about my favourite Victorian novels. I sat down and wrote a list of my favourite Victorian novels. There are 20, we'll probably be here for a while. Grab yourself a cup of tea and let's talk about Victorian literature. So as I said, I have 20 books to talk to you about today, only 5 of them by Dickens. You should all be very impressed by my restraint. I'm going to go through an order from 20 to 1. The top 10 are fairly structurally ordered, but the 20 to 10 are a bit more kind of loose. Basically, I love all of these books, they're all very good, you should read all of them, let's go. At number 20, Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Elizabeth Gaskell is one of my favourite Victorian authors. Probably my third favourite author of all time, I reckon. Elizabeth Gaskell is brilliant, and I love that all of her novels are so different. Wives and Daughters, unlike some of her other novels, is set in quite a rural location. It follows a character called Molly Gibson, who lives with her father, who is the parish doctor. They are very happy together, and then her father decides to remarry, and remarries a woman that Molly isn't incredibly keen on. However, Molly's new stepmother has a daughter, and Molly becomes friends with this daughter, and their relationship is quite significant to the plot. Another thing that is quite significant to the book is Molly's relationship with a family nearby called the Hamleys. I love Wives and Daughters, and I really want to reread it because I haven't read it for about 8 or 9 years now. It is a beautiful love story, but it is more than a love story, and I love that at the centre of it you have this relationship between Molly and her stepsister. I also love Molly as a character. She is very sweet and lovely and just one of those really nice, engaging characters who is just so nice to read about. It is such a lovely book, a really enjoyable read, and one I highly recommend. At number 19 we have Desperate Remedies by Thomas Hardy. I read this earlier this year and absolutely loved it. It's a very fast-paced, dramatic, gripping read with a lot of mystery and intrigue going into it, and quite a good villainous character. It follows a brother and sister, Owen and Cytherea, and after the death of their father, both of them are struggling for money. Owen is training to be an architect, and Cytherea goes on to become the servant or kind of companion to another woman whose name is also Cytherea. Just a great dramatic book, very fast-paced. I really like the character of Cytherea, and I love how much there is going on in Desperate Remedies. It is such an exciting, brilliant book. And number 18, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. It's a pretty good book and very dramatic. I love the gothic feeling throughout it and all of the various supernatural undertones that are kind of there but are not really what it's about. But more than anything, I think the thing I love about The Picture of Dorian Gray is Oscar Wilde's language. He writes beautifully, his dialogue is hilarious, his wit is so sharp and so clever and so well thought out, his sentences are so beautifully structured and so eminently quotable, and he's just a wonderful writer, and it makes the novel a joy to read. And number 17, The Egoist by George Meredith. I read this back in January and thoroughly loved it. It's one of the most surprisingly brilliant Victorian novels that I've read, I suppose, because it's one of those books I had just never heard of. It's absolutely brilliant. Not that accessible, the language is very difficult, and I wouldn't recommend it as a good starting place with Victorian literature, but if you are really interested in Victorian literature, especially if you're interested in the exploration of gender in Victorian literature, then I would highly recommend The Egoist by George Meredith. It is about a couple who get engaged, and then shortly after they've become engaged, Clara, the woman, begins to realise that she might not really want to marry this man. And the book is about her attempts to extract herself from that relationship, from that engagement. And it's a book that really examines the power play between genders within Victorian society and what power men have over women. It's just incredible and beautiful and so clever. For the first third of the book, I did find it quite slow, but the more I got into it and the more I became to fall in love with these characters that you get to know so well, and to really assess this situation and to realise just what incredible things George Meredith does with gender, with Victorian gender, is just great. It's so good, and I cannot recommend it enough. Maybe this should be higher than 17, I don't know. Anyway, I love all of these books a lot. Moving on. At number 16 we have The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, another Victorian novel that does incredible things with gender and is just a must read if you're interested in Victorian gender. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall follows 2 characters at its heart, a man called Gilbert and a woman called Helen. Gilbert meets Helen quite early on in the book, and at first they don't like each other, but as they come to know each other a little bit more, he begins to fall more in love with her and to discover more about her. But Helen always seems to have this mystery about her past, and we discover later on in the book that she was in a previously very abusive marriage. The way that the book explores this marriage and Helen's previous situation is just absolutely fascinating. I really love this book a great deal. I will link down below my Bronte Week video on this, and also I made a video which contains a lot of spoilers, so only watch it if you've read both this and Jane Eyre, comparing the plot of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall with Jane Eyre, because I think they have a lot of really interesting similarities. It's a really brilliantly written, thoroughly engaging book, and as I said, explores gender and the institution of Victorian marriage in a really, really interesting way. If you want to read a book about engagement in the Victorian period, read The Egoist. If you want to read a book about Victorian marriage, read this. At number 15, Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. I love Thomas Hardy a great deal. I love what he does with characters and with language, and I think he is the master of the love triangle, or more often in Hardy, the love square. Far from the Madding Crowd is about a woman called Bathsheba Everdeen. She inherits a farm from her uncle and goes to run the farm. Many people do not think she is capable because she is a woman, but she does impressive things, and Hardy is one of those writers that gets so close to feminism and then just falls like an inch short, but there are moments of great interest and moments where he does very interesting things with gender roles within this book. Bathsheba has 3 men who all sort of gravitate towards her, and the messy, complex relationships that go on from this are just brilliant. It's a great book and one I would highly recommend. At number 14, another Hardy, and this is Jude the Obscure, which is in fact my favourite Hardy novel. So no Hardy in my top 10 of Victorian novels, though I do love him a lot. Jude the Obscure follows a man called Jude who comes from quite a poor background but really wants to go to Christminster, or Oxford it basically is, to study because he loves Latin and education, but he always finds that this is blocked to him because of his background. He early on in his romantic life makes a mistake which influences the rest of his life, and so the book explores a lot of very interesting issues, both about background and class and the way that education is treated within Victorian society, but also about morality and marriage and love and sex within Victorian society, and the way in which living with someone outside of marriage was viewed, and what marriage is even, and what marriage might mean. It's just a brilliant, brilliant book. The central romantic relationship in this book is so raw and complicated and awful at times, but beautiful for a book that is incredibly sad and heart-wrenching and often very, very depressing. It also includes flashes of beautiful happiness and love, which are just brilliant, and I love it. It's beautiful, and Hardy's dialogue is at its best, its very best in Jude the Obscure. It is so well written and so emotional and just so incredible. At number 13 we have Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope, which is a brilliant, brilliant novel, and one I only read quite recently. This is the second novel in the Barchester Chronicles series, this first one being The Warden. I like The Warden, but I don't think it's as good as Barchester Towers. I also recently read Dr. Thorne, which is the third one, and I don't think it's as good as Barchester Towers. Barchester Towers is a brilliant, brilliant novel. It follows on from some of the characters in The Warden, and it looks at the relationship between various clergymen in Barchester and various clergymen's families, and the way that all of the church politics and high church versus low church interacts with each other. But there's also a beautiful love story in there, and there's also a lot about father-daughter relationships and family relationships and the power play between husbands and wives. I think what I love about Barchester Towers is it's so original and unique and different, and so different from other Victorian literature. The heroine of it, if it does have a heroine, is Eleanor, who is not a young, beautiful, angelic girl in her who is 18, but she's slightly older. She's in her very late 20s and she has a child, and she's just a very different character, and I really like that. I love the way that it explores church politics, and I think it's done much better than The Warden. The Warden is very heavy on church politics, and so is Barchester Towers, but in Barchester Towers the kind of opposition between high church and low church is symbolically shown between different characters in a way that is very, very effective. And so although it is a lot about Victorian religion, it doesn't feel like that, because it's more about the opposition between various characters and various viewpoints. And it's just a wonderful book at looking at Victorian society and the relationships between different people and the way that different people perceive other people, and it's just so engaging and so different and so original and unique and wonderful, and I love that. I love Victorian literature, as I'm sure this list shows, but sometimes there are certain tropes which are used again and again and again in Victorian literature, and I love it when a Victorian author just writes something that is just really different from all of the other Victorian tropes. It makes me so happy, and that is why Barchester Towers is brilliant. At number 12 we have The Netherworld by George Gissing. I often describe George Gissing as an urban Hardy, although he also deserves like his own merit because he is absolutely brilliant. I've still only read The Netherworld, but I'm hoping to start New Grub Street very soon and read that this month. The Netherworld is a brilliant, brilliant book that examines the interconnecting lives of various characters within London, all of whom are from a very poor working class background. To be honest, often below working class, because a lot of them are unemployed and very, very much struggling. It is a brilliant book that really examines so many important social issues and is full of so much social criticism. There was this idea through a lot of the Victorian period that people who were poor because they were immoral and they weren't hardworking, and basically the Netherworld is George Gissing's manifesto to the contrary, in which he points out that people who are forced into immorality and crime are maybe done so because they are really poor. It's just an absolutely brilliant, moving, heart-wrenching book that has such moments of utter poignancy in it that are just shattered by the state of the world, and it's so sad but beautiful and just so good, so utterly brilliant. I really cannot recommend The Netherworld enough. At number 11, finally onto the Dickens, I have David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Now, David Copperfield I would now like to refer to as my 5th favourite Dickens novel, which if you have been watching this channel since I did my What the Dickens series, you may remember was not my 5th favourite novel at that time. However, I'm currently rereading it / listening to it on audiobook, and I had forgotten how utterly incredible this book is, so it shot up in my Dickens estimation, and by the time I finished it, may well beat the one that is my 4th favourite Dickens at the moment. It's so good. David Copperfield follows the life of David Copperfield, unsurprisingly, and basically looks at his life and all of the fascinating, interesting people he meets, and there are so many wonderful characters. A very accessible look into so many aspects of Victorian life, and shows you so much about the daily life of certain people within Victorian society, especially because David in his life moves through so many social classes. A lot of Victorian literature looks at the theme of work, and there is this idea within the Victorian period that has never been so prevalent before, that what is moral is not the aristocracy, but the middle class who work because working is moral. And there is this fascinating ideal throughout Victorian literature of the hard-working middle class man, and definitely David Copperfield is a book that explores it in a really interesting way. If you're interested in the theme of work and also in ideas of masculinity in the Victorian period, then David Copperfield is very interesting to read. But there are these themes of hard work that are so instrumental to masculinity, but also there is a lot about emotion. And you have to understand is that in so much of Victorian literature, all the women cry and faint and the men are like... And I love in Dickens that lots of men cry. Makes me happy. At number 10, another Dickens, The Glorious Bleak House. Bleak House is a bit harder to explain than David Copperfield. At the heart of Bleak House there is a law case, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, which has been going on for decades and decades. A man called Mr. Jarndyce left a will, and no one has been quite able to work out who this money from the will ought to go to, and therefore various people, generations, have been born and died on the expectation of this money, and that is the thing that binds all of the different plot lines together in Bleak House. It's a very interestingly structured book. Half of it is from the first person perspective of a woman called Esther, who ends up being fostered in a way by a party in the Jarndyce case and ends up being brought into a family to be the companion of one of the wards of Jarndyce, of one of the wards of court under this case. And the other half of the book is in third person present tense, interestingly, which I find works very well. And this follows various different plot lines, all of which are interconnected with this legal case, and just... it's so brilliant. I love the way all of the plots interweave and just how many little mysteries there are and so many things to be solved throughout the book. I love all of the character relationships, the way that the book explores how money and the expectation of money can beat people to the ground. I love as well the exploration of Victorian masculinity. There are 2 characters who are both wards in court of Jarndyce, Richard and Ada, and the way that Richard is expected to have a profession and the difference between the way he is treated and the way Ada is treated says so much about Victorian gender. It's just fascinating. I'm sorry, I do like my Dickensian gender. Anyway, moving on. There are so many other wonderful aspects in this, so many brilliant, fascinating characters, some wonderful, horrible people. I hate Harold Skimpole so much, but there are also some brilliant, wonderful characters. Esther is a very interesting character, and Mr. Jarndyce likewise, as well as all of the many splendid, wonderful minor characters that are so fascinating. It's just such a great book, so enjoyable, such a wonderful, clever plot, and so many brilliant interweaving plots. I love it so much. At number 9 we have Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, a novel that will always have a great place in my heart because it is the novel that got me into Victorian literature, so yeah. A lot is down to you, Jane Eyre. A bit like David Copperfield, it is a kind of Bildungsroman, and we get to follow Jane Eyre over a substantial-ish portion of her life. Jane Eyre is born an orphan and brought up by an aunt who doesn't love her. She's then sent away to school, and from the school goes on to become a governess in a slightly deserted place called Thornfield Hall, where she begins to have a particular attachment to the master, Mr. Rochester. I just think it's a great book. It's so engaging and thoroughly enjoyable, and the relationship, the dynamic between Jane and Rochester is done so well. Their dialogue is supreme. It's so good, just the best literary flirting that has ever been. Better, I would say, than the literary flirting in Pride and Prejudice, which is a pretty high bar to set. And there are so many other fascinating themes explored throughout Jane Eyre. It is such an interesting, intriguing book that does so many interesting things with morality and marriage and exploration of what might be wrong or right and what love means, and all of the gothic, slightly supernatural things and what madness is, and just so many great things. What a book. Please go and read this. At number 8, another Anthony Trollope, my favourite Trollope novel indeed, which is The Way We Live Now, which is a novel I really love. It's one of Anthony Trollope's great, grand Victorian novels, more akin to Dickens in structure than some of his other novels, and certainly more so than the Barchester Chronicles. The Barchester Chronicles, I have found so far, tend to follow a slightly smaller set of characters, whereas The Way We Live Now is much more similar to a novel such as Bleak House in that it follows a lot of different strands of characters and linking them all together. A bit like in Bleak House, for example, there is a thread that links a lot of The Way We Live Now together, and that thread is a family called the Melmots who move into London from abroad. No one quite knows where they come from. They are a bit uncultured, a bit vulgar, but they have a lot of money, and that brings everyone towards the Melmots. The Way We Live Now examines all of the people in the orbit of the Melmots and all of the people in the orbit of the people who are in the orbit of the Melmots, and examines all of these characters and how their plots interlink. It is a book often about money and the way that money can ruin you. For me, it also compares as well to Bleak House in a really interesting way to Our Mutual Friend. And I actually wrote my A-level coursework essay on the different way that marriage is presented in Our Mutual Friend and The Way We Live Now. The Way We Live Now often explores the way in which money can be a corrupting force on people, and it also has a really interesting look at the relationships between characters and the way that marriage and engagement and love within Victorian society is often false and faked, and that it is often very much connected to money in a way that perhaps it shouldn't be. It's a brilliant novel full of so much social criticism, as well as a lot of wonderful, lovable characters, and a lot of characters that you feel you shouldn't love but you really do, and it's just great. Just so good. Yes, another great one. At number 7, Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell. I love this book, and it's one of the Victorian novels that has kept me the most thoroughly gripped, I think. It is a really engaging book. Also one of the Victorian novels I have found the most surprising. Because I've read a lot of Victorian literature, I sometimes find that I can predict certain things about a novel, especially who is going to end up with who when I start. Mary Barton, just completely unpredictable, but in a brilliant, wonderful, staggering way. Follows a character called Mary Barton who lives in a factory working community in Manchester. She is from a very working class background, but her father has hopes to slightly raise her, and so she works as a seamstress. She has 2 men who are interested in her. One is a man called Jim from a similar background to her, who she has known all her life. Then there is another man, a gentleman, who is very interested in her. And from the beginning you think it's going to be a kind of simple love triangle, and then events occur that change everything, and it's such a brilliant, thoroughly exciting, wonderful book. So good, and I just cannot recommend it enough. Oh, Elizabeth Gaskell, she is great. At number 6, Villette by Charlotte Bronte, which is a wonderful book, and one I love so much. I don't think it has as universal appeal as Jane Eyre, and there is a slightly annoying fact that a lot of the dialogue is in French, but I think it's a wonderful book. It follows a character called Lucy Snow, who through various events is left completely alone in the world. She's English, but she decides to go abroad to Belgium to teach in a school there, first as a kind of nursery maid and then teaching English. And she is a fascinating character. For me, it's a very psychologically complex book that really looks into the internal thoughts of Lucy Snow. And there is a passage in the middle of the book that I find fascinating where Lucy Snow is very unhappy, and from a modern perspective it feels like she's suffering from depression, and that's basically the feeling that Lucy Snow, or that Charlotte Bronte, is describing, but you wouldn't have had those terms to express it within the Victorian period. But from a modern perspective it's fascinating to read, and the way that loneliness and Lucy's feeling of isolation from so much, and her feeling of lacking friends and not being quite worthy to have friends, is just incredible. It's also a brilliant examination of unrequited love and of the kind of different sorts of love that you can find. And it's another one, in fact, like Mary Barton, where I could not predict the plot line. I love Villette so much, and I cannot recommend it enough. I think it's very underrated, and personally, in my opinion, superior to Jane Eyre in so many ways. If you find Jane Eyre vaguely unsatisfying on a feminist level, then you will find Villette really interesting, and it's just, oh, it's so good. It's so good. Finally, into my top 5 Victorian novels. 3 of them are Dickens, but I'm sure that won't surprise you. At number 5 is Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. What a glorious book. Little Dorrit follows the character of Amy Dorrit. Amy Dorrit was born inside the Marshalsea debtors prison because her father has been in there for a very, very long time. She lives there because she looks after her father, but she is allowed out and she works very hard in order to try and support her father as much as she can. And in her job, she works for a woman called Mrs. Clenham and ends up coming into contact with her son, Mr. Clenham, who takes a kind of interest in Amy Dorrit. They strike up a kind of friendship which is just so well explored and so interestingly done, and I love their relationship and dynamic. I think it's very, very well explored. I also love Amy as a character because she is one of Dickens's very, very interesting female characters that you get in his later novels. A very interesting ideal, especially if you're interested in the way that work and gender are explored within Victorian literature, because Amy is a woman that works, and this is quite an important thing within the Victorian period, but it's also important to remember that Amy is a woman that works, but she works to support her father, and therefore for Dickens that's like womanly because she's supporting someone. It's just really, really interesting if you're interested in gender. And although Amy is described as Little Dorrit and she's very, very physically small, she's 22, but often people mistake her for a child. However, she has this great emotional strength which is so impressive, and she's such a great character. There's so many brilliant minor characters, from Mr. Panks to Flora Finching to Frederick Dorrit, her uncle, who I just absolutely love, and then Fanny Dorrit, Amy's sister, who is a fascinating character, and the Meagles and Arthur Clenham, and so many brilliant characters. There are just so many fascinating plot lines and intricacies in this book, and I love the way that it explores class and culture and money and debt and family and relationships, and the way that the power dynamics between Arthur and Amy change over the book in terms of where they stand and therefore what that means in terms of gender. Oh, it's just great. It's great. It's so great. Also lots of male tears. Again, like David Copperfield, good Dickens, good. Lots of male emotion. That's what we like to see. At number 4, The Glorious North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell, which is just such a brilliant book. Such a brilliant book. It follows the character of Margaret Hale, who has grown up in the South as the daughter of a clergyman, and then her father, for reasons that remain slightly mysterious to her, moves her and her mother to Milton, which is a factory town in the north where there are a lot of mills. And Margaret at first is very distressed by this world and really disapproves of the way that things are run. She meets a mill owner called Mr. Thornton, who at first she despises, even though he is a bit taken with her in a kind of beautiful Pride and Prejudice-like manner. And things go on from there. And although the love story in this book is beautiful and brilliant and so well done, I love that the relationship between Margaret and Thornton is almost played out on a political level, and is so much about their clash of ideas about how you should run a factory and almost how you should run the world. Margaret also befriends a working family, the Higginses, and their reaction to the world they live in, especially Nicholas Higgins and the way that he is part of a union and is organising strikes, and how they feel about the way that masters run things and the way that the world is split up between masters and men. The class conflict in this book is fascinating, and it's such a clever social criticism with so many brilliant characters and a wonderful exploration both of family life and religion and relationships and romance, but also of these huge social issues going on. This clash of classes and the effects that industrialisation have on people is just a brilliant novel and a wonderful introduction to the Victorian period. At number 3 we have Wuthering Heights, a novel I am very fond of. Wuthering Heights is a weird novel, and I will freely admit that it is not for everybody. It is an odd, violent, brutal novel. It's not a nice love story like some people think it is. It is a book about revenge and anger and family feuds, but it's also brilliant. It's a very weird frame narrative. I have a diary written by a man called Lockwood, and in this diary Lockwood records a story told to him by a woman called Nellie Dean, and within the story that Nellie Dean is telling, sometimes she relates other characters telling her stories, or other letters, or letters in which characters tell other stories, and there's so many layers in which you can never quite get to the truth of any of the characters. I love that I don't love any of the characters in this book. So many of these characters, pretty much everyone apart from Hareton, is horrible and despicable and just awful. But if you like this book, and if you get involved with this book in the way that I do, then you sympathise with and understand every character. You feel their pain, even if you think they're awful people. And that is what is so clever about this book, and that is what I love. The structure and the fact that I both hate and also sympathise with so much all of these characters. Heathcliff is a wonderful character. He is absolutely fascinating. Yes, horrible. Yes, you wouldn't want to really hang out with him and have a cup of tea with him, but oh, you really want to read about him. And it's such such a good book, and one of those books that no matter how many times I read it, I always feel like I discover something more. The writing is beautiful, the dialogue's so clever, and it's just all in all a wonderful, wonderful book. My second favourite Victorian novel, and my second favourite novel of all time, is Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens. Dombey and Son begins with the birth of Dombey's son. Mr. Dombey has a daughter called Florence, who is about 7 at the beginning of the book, but he doesn't care for his daughter because no, he runs a company called Dombey and Son, and all that matters to him in life is that he will have a son to carry on the company with him. So his daughter Florence he completely neglects, but when his son Paul is born, he is very, very excited by this, and for him, Paul represents all of his hopes. He therefore completely neglects his elder daughter because he is so focused on his business and on the role his son will play in his business. Dombey and Son, in that way, is a fascinating exploration of gender and the way in which male and female children are treated differently within Victorian society. Although it's called Dombey and Son, the book is really not about Dombey and Son, it is about the daughter, it is about Florence. Partly about the neglect she feels, but also the way that she loves her brother, and the way that she loves her father despite all his neglect of her, and the way that as she grows up across the novel she begins to understand the role that she has been placed in, but to forgive her father at every turn. Later on in the book as well, there is a character called Edith who is just a wonderful character and explores some fascinating things in terms of Victorian marriage and gender. There are speeches by Edith Dombey which various critics have described as a feminist Dickens, and I think in this book for the first time you do see a sort of feminist Dickens coming through. I'm not going to go out there and say that Dickens was a feminist. I know he has a lot of very problematic things to say about women, and especially about like women who work and neglect their families. He has a lot of problematic stuff to say in his books, but in this book, as in a lot of his later works, he does fascinating things with gender and really explores things and has this agenda in which he obviously feels that there is something wrong with the way that men and women are treated differently in Victorian society. Dickens is one of those Victorians that doesn't necessarily feel that women and men can do all the same things, but I think it's fair to say that Dickens very, very, very strongly feels that men and women are equal. He just thinks that they have different roles within society, which is obviously problematic, but he does fight for the importance of women, even if not always in the right ways, and that is part of the reason why I love Dombey and Son, because in the character of Edith and the way that she speaks about marriage and what marriage in Victorian society has become is just absolutely brilliant. There are also so many wonderful, hilarious, beautiful minor characters, people like Susan, Florence's maid, who I just adore, or Mr. Toots, who is hilarious and wonderful, or Captain Cuttle, or just so many splendid, brilliant characters, and I love this book so much. It also has the most like emotional thing in all of Dickens, in my opinion, that just makes me sob, and it's just beautiful, and so much in this book that is amazing, and it's incredible, and please, please, please read it. But at the top of the tree, my favourite Victorian book and my favourite novel of all time is Our Mutual Friend. I feel like at one point I'm just going to run out of things to say about Our Mutual Friend because I speak about it so much. I will link down below all the other videos where I've spoken about this at great length. Basically, Our Mutual Friend is tied together in a similar way perhaps to Bleak House. At the centre of Bleak House there is a legal case. At the centre of Our Mutual Friend there is another will, a fortune. This fortune has been made by a man called Mr. Harmon, who made his money by sifting through dust and rubbish and making money out of it. He leaves his fortune to his son on the condition that his son marries a particular woman. His son, on his way back to England from abroad, is found drowned and everything goes on from there. It's all of these characters that are linked together through the Harmon case, and there are so many brilliant characters. This is Dickens's last finished novel, and for me it is his best. It is his novel which for me presents the most impressive and fascinating explorations of masculinity and femininity. It has his strongest characters, his best villain, his most fascinating plot. It explores brilliant themes about money and power and the way that money is so related to rubbish. It has so many brilliant characters, from the wonderful Lizzie Hexam to the fascinating, brilliant, hilarious, awesome, thoroughly badass Jenny Wren, from the disillusioned but fascinating Eugene Rayburn to the terrifying, sinister but also oddly sympathetic at times Bradley Headstone, from the scheming Lamleys to the wonderful warm-hearted Boffins. It just has so many characters and so many wonderful things, and I love this book a great deal, and it's wonderful, and that's all I have to say. So there we have it. Those are my 20 favourite Victorian novels. I have great fears about how long this video has been, but hopefully you have enjoyed hearing about some beautiful, beautiful Victorian novels that I highly recommend. Please let me know down in the comments what your favourite Victorian novel is, and I'll be back very soon with another Victorian video. Happy Victober, everybody.